In the year 1424, following the death of Ming Emperor Yongle, 30 concubines from the royal harem were handed the ominous flood-red square of silk. This small piece of fabric signified that these 30 women were among the emperor's favorites. However, it also sealed their fate. They were not meant to outlive the emperor. Life as a concubine in the Forbidden City was as perilous as it was opulent, as restrictive as it was indulgent, and as punishing as it was pleasurable. Just how lonely and despairing were their lives? What harsh selection process did they endure? And what did it take to survive as a concubine in Imperial China? Welcome to Nutty History. Today we'll uncover the bleak reality of life for Imperial Chinese concubines. Viewer discretion is advised, as some content in this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the creators of this video, do not support or condone the actions of the individuals featured. When a wandering monk rose up in rebellion against his Mongol overseers and reclaimed China for the Chinese people, he declared himself the Hongwu Emperor. As the founder of the Ming Empire, the Hongwu Emperor established the foundations for one of the greatest periods of orderly governance and social stability in human history. The history of the Ming dynasty possesses a dual nature. On one hand, they propelled China into a golden age, transforming the nation into a global power. On the other hand, they achieved this through tyranny and the suppression of their subjects, including the practice of taking their daughters as concubines for the emperor if he so desired. The tradition of keeping concubines in ancient China seems to be as old as time itself, likely beginning with the Western Zhou dynasty, which was established around 1000 BCE. In those early days, a man could keep as many concubines as he could afford. The practice was not merely a reflection of a man's wealth, but also a symbol of his social and political power. Concubines were often seen as status symbols, their beauty and talents adding to the prestige of their master. However, during the Eastern Han period, restrictions were imposed on the number of concubines a man could have, with the allowance increasing according to one's rank. Historically, the term concubine could encompass various meanings, but in the context of Imperial China, it carried two specific connotations. In pre-modern China, a man was generally not permitted to have more than one wife at a time, except in the special circumstance where the first wife failed to bear a child by the time the man reached 40. In such cases, men would satisfy their polygamous desires by keeping concubines. The practice of concubinage evolved significantly from the Western Zhou dynasty to the Ming and Qing dynasties. While the Western Zhou dynasty laid the groundwork for concubinage, the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, saw the role of concubines becoming more formalized within the imperial court. Concubines were not only a source of pleasure, but also a means of securing political alliances. High-ranking officials often gifted their daughters to the emperor as concubines to gain favor, a practice that continued into the Ming and Qing dynasties. By the time of the Ming dynasty, concubinage had become an institutionalized aspect of court life. The Hongwu Emperor, often regarded as one of China's greatest rulers, had a darker side behind the palace doors. He was known to imprison and punish his concubines, driven by an extreme possessiveness that led him to control every aspect of their lives and even their deaths. The Hongwu Emperor also revived the ancient tradition that required concubines to lose their lives upon the emperor's death. Furthermore, he mandated that subjects had to offer their daughters to the administrators if the emperor desired them as concubines. To consolidate his imperial power and ensure the security of the royal family, The Hongwu Emperor ordered the construction of a forbidden palace in 1366. The Ming Palace was completed 2 years later, and Ku Wanchong, also known as the Hongwu Emperor, moved his seat there in Nanjing. Meanwhile, the Forbidden City, which would later serve as the capital for China's last two imperial dynasties, the Ming and Qing, was built in Beijing under the rule of the Yongle Emperor. Over the centuries, this grand complex became not only the political heart of China, but also the home to thousands of concubines who served various emperors. The Forbidden City was both the residence of the emperor and empress, and a gilded prison for the countless concubines confined to the inner court, forbidden from leaving. These women lived isolated lives, devoted to serving the emperor, the empress, and the emperor's parents, with their primary purpose being to provide services to the emperor and bear male heirs. The only men permitted within the inner court were eunuchs, ensuring that the legitimacy of the emperor's children was never questioned, akin to the rooster in the henhouse situation. Some Ming emperors kept nearly 9,000 concubines, but during the reigns of Emperors Huan and Ling, the Forbidden City housed nearly 20,000 women. The sheer number of women within the palace walls created an environment rife with competition, jealousy, and intrigue. The isolation of the concubines, coupled with the constant need to vie for the emperor's attention, often led to intense psychological strain. Nevertheless, the hierarchy within the imperial Chinese harem was always led by the empress at the top. As the official wife of the emperor, the empress was the most venerated and revered figure for women in China, with the entire nation viewing her as the mother of the world, just as the emperor was considered the father of heaven. The empress was second only to the emperor and his mother, the empress dowager, and held authority over all the concubines, maids, and eunuchs who served the royal family. Following the empress in the harem's hierarchy were the consorts, though their number varied with each ruling dynasty. These consorts were typically the daughters of high-ranking officials, either gifted to or claimed by the emperor as his partners, although they were not officially married to him. Below the consorts were the concubines, whose ranks could vary from 3 to 5, depending on the emperor's preference. The competition among concubines was fierce, with each one plotting, scheming, and striving to impress in order to advance their position while fiercely guarding their unofficial rankings. The most effective way for a concubine to rise in status was to bear a male heir for the emperor. However, the higher the number of consorts, the slimmer the chance any one concubine had of actually spending a night with the emperor. This scarcity of opportunity led to rampant intrigue and constant bickering among the concubines, making daily life in the Forbidden City far from one of pleasure and leisure. The psychological toll on the concubines was immense. The constant competition and the lack of autonomy contributed to a sense of despair and hopelessness. Many concubines suffered from depression and anxiety, exacerbated by the isolation and rigid control exercised by the emperor and his court. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense, and failure to do so often led to a lifetime of neglect and loneliness. Additionally, the constant surveillance and the fear of being reported to the emperor by other concubines or eunuchs created a climate of paranoia. The fear of falling out of favor or being accused of misconduct led many concubines to isolate themselves even further, exacerbating their loneliness. The sense of isolation was not just physical, but also emotional, as many concubines were cut off from their families and had no one to confide in. The lives of concubines have been a frequent subject in Chinese literature, art, and drama. Novels such as The Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Lu Meng, by Cao Xueqin, one of the 4 great classical novels of China, vividly depict the complex dynamics and tragic lives of women in wealthy households, including concubines. In traditional Chinese opera, the figure of the concubine often symbolizes both beauty and sorrow. embodying the tensions between power and vulnerability. Paintings from the Ming and Qing periods also reflect the lives of concubines, often portraying them in luxurious surroundings, but with expressions that hint at their inner turmoil. These cultural artifacts provide valuable insights into how concubines were perceived and how they themselves might have viewed their circumstances. The idealized images of concubines in art often mask the harsh realities they faced, making their real-life experiences even more poignant. Concubinage was not unique to China. Similar practices existed in other cultures, including the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan's harem was a central part of court life. However, the structure and function of concubinage varied significantly across cultures. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, concubines could rise to significant power, with some, like Hürrem Sultan, becoming influential political figures. In contrast, the rigid social hierarchy and Confucian values in China generally limited the power of concubines, although there were notable exceptions like Wu Zetian and Cixi. Comparing the experiences of concubines across different cultures provides a broader perspective on the role of women in patriarchal societies and the ways in which they navigated power structures. While the specific conditions and outcomes varied, the underlying theme of women being used as tools for political and social gain remains consistent. During the Qing dynasty, life became even more challenging for consorts and concubines, as their rank determined the type of clothing they could wear, the food they were allowed to eat, and the privileges they were entitled to, constantly reminding them of their place in the hierarchy. The Qing rulers, particularly under emperors Kangxi and Qianlong, instituted more formalized systems of rank and privilege, further entrenching the rigid structure of the imperial harem. Most of their activities were closely monitored by the eunuchs, who held significant power within the palace. The eunuchs were not only gatekeepers but also informants, often manipulating the system to their advantage. Before the emperor visited a concubine's bedchamber, she was required to bathe and undergo an examination by a court doctor, a process that further dehumanized the women by reducing them to mere objects of desire. Confucianism, which deeply influenced Chinese society, played a significant role in shaping the practice of concubinage. Confucian values emphasized the importance of hierarchy, filial piety, and the continuation of the family line. These principles justified the practice of concubinage as a means to ensure the birth of male heirs, which was considered essential for the stability of the family and the state. Buddhism and Taoism, other major philosophical influences in China, also impacted the lives of concubines. Buddhism's emphasis on detachment and suffering resonated with many concubines, some of whom sought solace in religious practices or even became nuns after their time in the palace. Taoist teachings, which advocate for harmony with nature and the universe, offered an alternative worldview that contrasted sharply with the rigid structures of court life. With hundreds, sometimes even thousands of concubines at the emperor's disposal, any woman who was fortunate enough to receive a visit from him would inevitably become the subject of intense jealousy and rivalry. Each concubine had her own quarters and would spend her days applying makeup, sewing, practicing various arts, and socializing with other concubines. However, many of these women spent their entire lives within the palace walls without ever having direct contact with the emperor. Love was essentially forbidden for concubines, with very few exceptions to this rule. Despite this, some concubines did form secret relationships with eunuchs or other officials, but if they were caught, the consequences were severe. The story of the forbidden love between a concubine and a eunuch is one that appears repeatedly in Chinese folklore, often ending in tragedy. These tales highlight the deep human need for connection and the ways in which the oppressive environment of the imperial court stifled that need. While serving in the palace, no concubine was allowed to communicate with the outside world, not even with their own families. When they fell ill, no physicians were permitted to see them. Instead, a eunuch would describe the symptoms to a doctor, who would then prescribe treatment based solely on this second-hand information. This lack of direct medical care often led to prolonged suffering or even death, further illustrating the harsh realities of life within the Forbidden City. Escape from the Forbidden City was nearly impossible. The most likely way out was simply to grow old enough that the Emperor would lose interest in you, a feat easier said than done. In such cases, concubines were sometimes allowed to return to their families with a modest pension. However, the stigma attached to having served as a concubine often meant that these women were ostracized by society, leaving them isolated even after their release. Some concubines were gifted to foreign kings and emperors, but in those instances, it could be argued that they were merely exchanging one form of captivity for another. The practice of gifting concubines as part of diplomatic exchanges was common, and these women often found themselves in unfamiliar lands, far from home, and without any means of returning. Their fates in these foreign courts were often grim, as they were seen as outsiders and treated with suspicion. A very few, however, were bold enough to attempt an actual escape. For those who succeeded, there was no returning. If caught, they faced certain execution. Many concubines ultimately resigned themselves to their fate, choosing to continue their servitude as royal maids, or even opting to become nuns. The decision to become a nun was seen by some as a way to reclaim some measure of control over their lives, although it also meant a life of poverty and isolation. Throughout Chinese history, there have been rare exceptions to the typical fate of concubines. One of the most remarkable is Empress Wu Zetian of the Tang dynasty. She began her life in royal service as a concubine to Emperor Taizong at a young age. When Taizong died, Wu Zetian was only 25, and at that time, widows and concubines of a deceased emperor were expected to retire to monasteries. However, Wu Zetian managed to captivate Taizong's successor, Gaozong, beginning her ascent to power. She eventually promoted herself to the position of empress, and at the age of 66, became the sovereign of all China. Wu Zetian's rise to power was extraordinary in many ways. Not only did she break the traditional confines of her role as a concubine, but she also became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her reign, though controversial, was marked by significant developments in education, literature, and the arts. Wu Zetian's story is a testament to the complex dynamics of power within the imperial court and the rare instances where a concubine could transcend her prescribed role. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the infamous Empress Dowager Cixi, who played a key role in the downfall of the Qing dynasty. Cixi started as a favored concubine of Emperor Xianfeng, but after his death, she became the de facto ruler of China by securing control over her 5-year-old son, the emperor. Cixi orchestrated the 1861 Xinyu coup, which allowed her to take sole charge of the young emperor. As Empress Dowager, she lived a life of extreme luxury, indulging in privileges while neglecting the responsibilities of governance, even as China was ravaged by social upheaval and the Second Opium War. Cixi's rule was characterized by a blend of cunning political maneuvering and ruthless suppression of dissent. Her influence over the imperial court was unmatched, and she wielded power from behind the scenes, effectively controlling the fate of the Qing dynasty. However, her legacy is marred by her failure to modernize China, leading to the eventual collapse of the dynasty and the end of imperial rule in China. The selection process for imperial concubines in China became more regulated during the Qing dynasty. The Qing ruled China between the 3rd and early 5th centuries. Even during the Ming and Qing dynasties, the criteria for selecting concubines were primarily based on the preferences of the reigning emperor. During the Ming dynasty, the Hongwu emperor ensured that no household in China was exempt from this process. The Ming emperors required every young unmarried woman who had no physical deformity or disability to undergo the Zunu selection process. In contrast, the Qing dynasty focused the selection process primarily on families within the Eight Banners, who were predominantly of Manchu or Mongolian descent, thereby excluding the Han population. The Eight Banners were military and administrative divisions under the Qing dynasty, and membership within these groups determined one's social status and privileges. The selective process for concubines from within these families ensured that the emperor's harem was filled with women from loyal and elite lineages, further entrenching the power of the ruling class. On the day of selection, young girls were brought to the gates of the Forbidden City for inspection. Accompanied by their parents or guardians, these girls had to undergo a beauty examination conducted by both the emperor and his parents. Fewer than 100 girls would pass this initial inspection, after which they would be thoroughly examined to ensure they were physically healthy and free from any afflictions. This inspection included checks for skin infections, body hair, body odor, and other physical attributes before they were sent to be trained by experienced women. The selected girls would spend several nights with these women, who specialized in training maids to serve the royal family. During this period, they were rigorously disciplined and taught the skills necessary for court life, including proper behavior, speaking, gesturing, and walking. They were also instructed in various art forms, such as painting, reading, writing, chess, and dancing. Those who successfully completed this demanding training would go on to serve the Empress Dowager as maids, preparing for their potential roles as concubines. The purpose of this servitude was to please the emperor's mother and earn her favor, which could lead to a higher rank within the concubinage. The girls would undergo additional inspections by the emperor's mother, who was particularly vigilant in identifying any undesirable nocturnal habits, such as snoring, emitting odors, or talking and walking in their sleep. Only a very select few who made it through this rigorous process would succeed in catching the emperor's attention. Most concubines, however, spent their lives in bitter loneliness, which inevitably led to harmful politics and jealousy among them. In truth, beauty was often more of a curse than a blessing in China during this period. Women in Chinese society were generally regarded as inferior, subjected to continuous demoralization, degradation, humiliation, and neglect. For concubines, the situation was even more dire. They occupied the lowest rungs of society, their existence marred by profound injustice. It was rare for a concubine to seek and obtain freedom, but one notable exception was Wen Shu, who managed to divorce her emperor Fu Yi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, though only after he had been dethroned and was on the run. Others chose more extreme forms of retaliation, such as one of the Yongle emperor's favorite concubines, who, in despair over her forbidden love for a palace eunuch, could no longer bear her life in the palace. She ultimately decided to leave and never share a bed with the emperor again. Some women, however, grew too bold. Emperor Jia Jing, a descendant of the Yongle emperor, became the target of a plot by 16 of his concubines, known as the Renyan plot. Exhausted by his unusual and cruel dietary demands, these women attempted to attack him in his chambers, but failed. The consequences were severe. The empress ordered their immediate execution. In death, as in life, these women endured great suffering. The Renyan plot is a stark reminder of the desperation felt by many concubines trapped within the palace walls. Despite the risks, these women chose to challenge the emperor's authority in a final act of defiance. Their tragic fate underscores the harsh realities of life as a concubine in Imperial China, where any form of resistance was met with brutal punishment. The lives of concubines were inextricably linked to the eunuchs who served in the imperial court. Eunuchs were castrated men who served in various administrative and domestic roles within the palace. Due to their unique position, they wielded significant power and influence, often acting as intermediaries between the emperor and the concubines. The trust placed in eunuchs was based on the belief that, being castrated, they posed no sexual threat to the women of the court and were thus safe to serve in close proximity to them. However, this trust also gave eunuchs considerable leverage, which they sometimes exploited to manipulate court politics. Some eunuchs amassed great wealth and power, often surpassing that of the concubines they were meant to serve. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines was complex, with some forming close alliances while others became rivals. The eunuchs' control over access to the emperor meant that they could make or break a concubine's fortunes, further adding to the intrigue and power struggles within the Forbidden City. The legacy of imperial concubinage in China is one of both power and suffering. While a few concubines managed to rise to positions of influence, the vast majority lived lives of quiet despair, their existence dictated by the whims of the emperor and the rigid hierarchy of the court. The stories of women like Wu Zetian and Empress Dowager Cixi offer a glimpse into the complex dynamics of power within the imperial harem. But they also highlight the extraordinary challenges faced by women in ancient China. As we reflect on the lives of these women, it is important to recognize the broader cultural and historical context in which they lived. The practice of concubinage was deeply intertwined with the social, political, and economic structures of the time, and its impact can still be felt in the cultural memory of China today. Let us know in the comments if you'd like to see a video about the lives of eunuchs in Imperial China. As always, thank you for watching Nutty History. If you enjoyed this video, please follow, like, and subscribe for more amazing content.